Warning, this podcast contains adult language and is not suited for children.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Squared Circle Sit Down. My name is Joe, and thank you again for joining us this week to discuss the world of professional wrestling. Now, you can find the Squared Circle Sit Down on your podcast platform of choice, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, or Stitcher. And we're also over on YouTube, where you can give us some love with feedback. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. And now I'm going to turn things over to the host of the Squared Circle Sit Down. He is at the Lion Knight 42 over on Twitter, and he's my wrestling therapy buddy. He is Drake.
Well, hi, Joe.
Hello.
Man, another crazy week for wrestling, huh?
What is this?
Yes, it is. So this week, we saw what may very well be the final throes of Ring of Honor. Kind of a shame seeing this company that has, meant so much to so many people, end up where it is. And really, it's nice to have seen them at least try and go out on a high note in the event that we don't see this company again in any real way. And I mean, last night they did a really good job of making everyone feel like they're hireable, if nothing else. They really went out of their way to try and ensure that all of their talent looked like they belong on television somewhere, and that's really classy. I don't want to spend too much time on this tonight because I know this isn't our topic for the night, but I do think that it's worth mentioning and worth discussing a bit.
Yeah, I've somebody who's never followed Ring of Honor religiously. I've always known they existed since the mid 2000s. You just hear stories of the matches, and I've seen a good number of Ring of Honor matches, especially the ones where word spreads around the wrestling community online, and you have to go watch it. Especially some of the early days when guys made their way over to TNA or even WWE, like CM Punk or Samoa Joe, Bryan Danielson, and many others. That you have to look at Ring of Honor and you have to look at their legacy and just see the pure volume of talent that has gone through those doors and performed in that ring. For anybody that wants to know who hasn't followed Ring of Honor from the beginning, maybe never at all, just go online, look up the history of the Ring of Honor World Championship, and just look at the list of names. And you can, again, go back and you have your CM Punk and your Samoa Joe, and then you move on to guys like Adam Cole and Kyle O'Reilly and just so many people over the years. And now you, of course, end with a match that, as you told me, having seen it, I haven't gotten to watch it yet, where tears in the eyes of a competitor because of what this means. This is a significant chapter in the history of professional wrestling, possibly coming to a close. And that's sad. It's bittersweet in the fact that they got to have this show. This is something that not every company gets to have. We were both around to see WCW close its doors in what some people never thought would happen. And it went out in very unceremonious fashion on one of the worst years that it had had. So for Ring of Honor to have this and still have the chance to move on in some way. The titles are still around. There's the talent, of course, is still going to get work somewhere. Thankfully, we're in an era where that can happen. But it's bittersweet. I think I'll always come back to that word whenever something like this happens.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's a shame seeing it, especially, like you said, yeah, there's an upside with the fact that most of the talent is going to probably have somewhere to land. But it's really unfortunate, especially now in an era where there is so much more love for wrestling in wrestling and so much more support coming from so many different places that, they just couldn't keep going. I will say that they made some really good decisions last night. They created this concept that I think is going to follow in the steps of what early, like, Billy Corgan NWA was, where we're going to have the, like, wandering champions. You've got Jonathan Gresham with the world title, who's probably going to... I'd be very surprised if he didn't defend it in some form, or at least have it with him at Terminus and maybe show up on other televised programs to defend it once or twice here or there. I'd love personally to see him at AEW. I think that's possible. I think Impact's a good possibility, even if it's somewhere like MLW and at local indie shows. I think it's a great opportunity for that. Roxy and Diona Purrazzo is something that we're going to see down the line, most likely in Impact, maybe in Mexico, but we don't really know yet. All we know is that's something that will be coming. We had the teaser with FTR and the Briscoes, which was a really cool setup, regardless of my personal feelings on them boys. And I think that it definitely was the right way to go. Like I said, they made all of their talent feel really strong. They made everyone look good. And at the end of the day, that's kind of all you can ask, right? Is to ensure that the people who are coming out of your company at the end of its run are people who feel like they're ready to keep carrying that banner elsewhere. If they come back in April or not, we don't know, and we won't know until April. Because realistically, until we get an announcement that they are closing their doors for good, or that they are announcing a date and ticket sales, there's really no point in speculating one way or another. But like you said, the impact that Ring of Honor has had on our business is nothing short of legendary. So many of our main event talent right now are in the place they're in because of Ring of Honor, right? You mentioned Danielson, you mentioned CM Punk. You've got guys like Kevin Steen, El Generico, Sami Zayn, who are guys that are cornerstones of that company, who helped, build it with blood, sweat, and tears. Adam Cole, who just are where they are because of Ring of Honor, in the same way that wrestling is where it is because of them and because of Ring of Honor. There's just so much value that company had and continues to have in just its existence. It was an alternative product in the weak years of WWE. It was somewhere that you could trace a lot of guys from TNA or Impact, as it's known now, back to for a long time. And even as Ring of Honor arguably petered out over the last couple years in popularity, it still provided solid matchups more often than not. And when it didn't, it still was sort of the springboard for some of the names that would rise to prominence in other companies, in AEW, in Impact, in MLW, and like I said, even in WWE.
Yeah, and they were always a company that was around. They never felt like they fell off so hard that you couldn't watch them anymore, which is strange for a company because almost every other company feels like it has those down years where it's just you don't care about the product anymore, or there's just a talent exodus to the point where you're not invested, something like that. Ring of Honor never seemed to hit that point. They were never the number one company, of course, in the United States, we're talking. And they never really lasted as a number two. I think Impact was almost always ahead of them. And maybe you could argue a couple of years here or there, but now, of course, AEW is around. So, and the proliferation of indies is a thing that we could look at in the 2010s. But Ring of Honor, for me anyway, I always found to be conceptually one of the coolest wrestling companies around, just as an idea. Because if you just look at the name of Ring of Honor, that's what it is. It is, you're taking usually two guys and they're going to go out to the ring and the rules are going to tell you, hey, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. You go in, you shake hands, and you have your match. You beat the crap out of each other usually, because that's what their style was. You try really hard to win within the rules, and then you win or lose, pinfall, submission, whatever. Get up, respect is shown, you go to the back, the next match comes on. That's something that they did. And of course, there were deviations to that, and you had rules without honor or something like that.
It was like fight without honor.
Fight without honor. There you go. See, it's been a while. But, and again, they deviated from that concept when necessary. They obviously put on lots of different gimmick matches over the years, and they've been amazing. They've been terrible. They've had everything in between. But conceptually, they presented in the United States a different feel of wrestling to WWE, the big sports entertainment company, which is something we talked a lot about last week. And this is the beginning of the juxtaposition this week. And we get to see that sports-like feel and what that contributed to the business of pro wrestling. At least in the United States, it was Ring of Honor. And it's a different take around the world. But that's what we're talking about this week, right? The sports feel in wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely. One last thing I do want to tack onto that is they came up with also the concept of the pure championship, right? And the pure matches, which had like limited numbers of rope breaks and were timed contests and very much were positioned to feel like just the closest thing you could get to a shoot wrestling match as you could. Which was just a really cool concept and handled very well, even in their like later years when they brought back the pure title and they did a tournament, which was fantastic.
Point to that, last week you referenced the legitimate heel as something that is very much created here. It has its origins in Ring of Honor, where a heel could be a heel by just not respecting the rules in just the right way without necessarily breaking them. You see it even now where Bryan Danielson could be like, oh, hey, I got you in a submission, you grab the rope, and the ref is counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're not holding it past 5, but they're telling the ref, no, I have told the count of 5. And that's the rules. Like, and it's a dirty, underhanded tactic to, rule shark somebody, for lack of a better term. I know that means a lot to us. It may not mean a lot to everybody, but it's when you're intentionally using the rules to your advantage, maybe in a slightly underhanded way, where you might be taking advantage of somebody else. And that's something that originated in this area, to do whatever it takes to win, not necessarily by cheating, but just using all the boundaries of the rules, because you are that good, you know them. And Ring of Honor and what they established allowed characters to do that, allowed wrestlers to do that.
Absolutely. It also was a big boon when they started working with like Japan and bringing the Japanese style of wrestling over here, where you had that really healthy mixture of talent and they all sort of existed on the same page, because the style of wrestling they were presenting was a really good middle ground between the like pro wrestling, sports entertainment, whatever you'd like to call it, that we know here as American fans, and wrestling as a sport that we see from places like New Japan. It was a really good way to introduce people to that new sort of style that has gotten really popular over here over the years and permitted guys like Shinsuke Nakamura and Ikemen Jiro and, notable others to be able to come over and have that kind of success. Suzuki on his most recent run, to be able to do that and really connect with an American audience, whereas otherwise they wouldn't have had that opportunity. Also, I mean, there's the direct ties that Ring of Honor has to AEW, right? You look at the Young Bucks, who owe all of their success really to Ring of Honor, and Cody, who maybe not as much, but still played a huge role in where he is now and finding the character that he would become and maybe is still becoming. But that's another talk for another day. We're both good guys, right? You've got Kenny Omega, of course, who, huge deal in Japan, but also was such a recognizable name over in Ring of Honor and was such a big part of that whole situation, AJ Styles, where that really was a big deal. And like you said, bringing us on to the topic, which is wrestling as a sport, where better to have the bulk of that discussion than focusing on New Japan Pro Wrestling. So New Japan Pro Wrestling is, for the uninitiated, the biggest wrestling company in Japan. And it's not really surprising when you look at what they've done to sort of distinguish themselves and capitalize on really a cultural understanding and presenting such a different experience. So New Japan Pro Wrestling has, for a very, very long time now, prided themselves on presenting a show that is a sport. They treat it very much like the NBA, the NHL, the MLB, insofar as it's all about, being as successful as possible within the confines of what you're doing, and just the way that they present it, the way the commentary team works, the way that their like yearly schedule is set up, even is all about that. They have their, to steal an AEW phrase, they have kind of their tent pole shows, which are their big ones, and then they've got other events that they do tours that lead up to, right? Instead of having weekly shows, which I mean they do in some sense because they have highlight shows, but instead of having weekly shows that constantly continue these ongoing character heavy storylines, their tales are sort of told in a mixture of the multi-person matches that they have leading up to their singles matches, which are considered, big, capstones because they are, the next like UFC fight, and in the backstage interviews that they have post show, which are handled again sort of in the same way that sports are. And a lot of the character work is developed there through those sort of post show interview promos, whatever you want to call them, online packages, and just through learning who your athlete is, right? And we talked about this a little bit last week too, where you can't look at a guy in New Japan for 20 minutes as he wrestles a match and be like, okay, I know the entire bulk of like who this guy is and who he's trying to be and what his beef is with anyone else. I mean, this is a company where a guy feuded with a championship for years, um, based on so much nuance about the sport and how his place in that sport was relevant because of, the accolades and where he would find himself, and the fact that realistically, whereas in WWE, like we talked about, it's really not always about winning your match. Here, it very much is about winning your match. Very few of these matches are interested in, just hurting you. I want revenge. Sure, but the revenge is through defeating you. I get revenge by getting the winner's purse, right? Even if I'm here to embarrass you. New Japan puts a really big value on its tournaments, which it runs a lot of every year, and it tries to sort of make those, use those as an engine to create more of that sports feel. Win these tournaments because these tournaments offer big purses, because these tournaments mean you are the best. Everyone wants to be the best because these purses mean that you get title opportunities, and the titles here are, once again, the inverse of last week, are very important.
Yeah, there's two things. Like, take a breath, seriously, like, because you're gonna go down the entire history of New Japan, and there is so much of it.
I'm sorry, I'm a huge New Japan mark. So like,
that's okay. It's good. It shows that there is a legitimate audience for this on the global scale, and New Japan has not always reached that, but the internet and television and streaming services now allow for that, which goes back to the proliferation of indies. If you have a platform, you might have an audience, and that's important for pro wrestling in a way that it never has been before, because getting those platforms is much different than it used to be. So for New Japan, you have very much what you just said. Like, it's a counterpoint to several things we talked about last week, where last week we talked about titles being props. Titles are not props and not presented as props in New Japan Pro Wrestling. They are presented as championships. You win them, they are prestigious. Last week I talked about how you could almost always look at characters and titles as things that you can have stock in, and stock goes up and down depending upon how it's presented over time. It is incredibly rare that if you follow that concept with, let's just take the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. If you take that championship, it is almost never losing stock, no matter who it's on. It's almost always high. The concept of, does the title make the guy or does the guy make the title? That title always makes the guy. Always. It is always held higher than the highest champion of ever, right? A Tanahashi, Kota Ibushi, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it is. Okada, Omega, Styles, no matter who it is. Worldwide, it didn't matter if Hulk Hogan came out and won that championship. This championship means more than Hulk Hogan. That's how it's presented. That's how people act when they win it, and that's how it is presented when it is defended. Looking at a company very quickly like AEW, because this is just for a very specific point, AEW attempts to present itself with a sports-like flair by keeping track of wins and losses. New Japan doesn't necessarily do that, but they do keep track of very specific statistics, such as how many champions there have been, the lineage of the championship, how long you have been champion, how many times you have defended that championship. These are incredibly telling statistics because when you look at them, it says, wow, that guy's important because he's managed to do X number of things with that championship. And that championship is the most prestigious thing that New Japan has. You can't get higher than that. The tournaments that you have during the year are to fight for it. The matches that you have that you win are to either get in a tournament, get seeded in a tournament, get ranked somewhere in this so that you might have a chance to fight for that championship. That's what that means. That's why you look at somebody who is the IWGP heavyweight champion and you say they may be the best wrestler in the world. Why? Because they're that champion. And you can't be that champion if you're not. Just as a second thing, and this is slightly unrelated, but it fits that same thing, like that same mold. I'll use the word already. Last week mentioned the point of in WWE, you play a character. The character is established. You play it how they want you to. If you don't fit that character, they're going to get somebody else. They change the character. You don't. So there's no like dynamicism to the character. It's either just it's a static thing or it changes over time when they feel like changing the story. That's not the same concept here because now you don't have pre-established characters. You have people who are going out there and performing. They are athletes who are trying to win matches. So it's very different how you make storylines happen, how you have characters grow and evolve over time. It's very, very different. And I think we can get more into that as we go along. But I feel like you were going to say something about the title.
Oh, like I said, I can go on for hours about this topic. But yes, so when we're talking about like the championships, you're right. There's such a big emphasis put on them, and for good reason. Like you said, the title always makes the person, and it's so true, and it is such a good. They're so good usually. They have been for a long time very good at using that to take even guys who aren't necessarily super over or relevant and changing that. If you look at Yoshihashi in the last few years, is actually a really good story of that, where his existence is kind of a meme. He's not a guy who anyone really has taken seriously for a long time or cared about. There's someone here or there who's like, push Yoshi, but it's not a thing. And then, he had a relatively strong showing in the G1 a few years back, out of almost nowhere, and then had this six-man tag title run, which is a title that most people in New Japan don't really care about, like, as fans, right? Like, it goes everywhere. It doesn't fit that mold as much, but still, he wins that title, and it's a big deal. And he feels better for it, and he looks better for it. Because even though, he's been on the weak streak he's been on, it can turn around with a good showing in a tournament and a decent title run. Because that's how New Japan has structured themselves for a long time now.
Yeah. Similarly, like, I don't follow New Japan as much as you do, but you can look at the growth of someone, the stock building in someone like Jeff Cobb, who for years he's been there, he's been around, he's always put on quality matches, maybe not 5 stars the way some main events go, but he puts in good work. He's a good ring worker. And he's had a 2021 showing of not only back at Wrestle Kingdom, but now in the G1 where it's historic. And as a fan, you can't help but look at that and say, oh, wow, maybe I was wrong about this guy. Well, if you didn't have stock in him, if you didn't believe in him, if you didn't see something in him, okay, fine. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I start to question that. Or maybe if you did already, if you were a fan of Jeff Cobb, now it's a, see, I told you. I knew it. I knew he'd get there eventually. And it doesn't feel like, oh, they threw you a bone the way it happens in WWE sometimes of, yeah, Finn Balor gets a title shot against Roman Reigns. Here you go, guys. We know you like Finn Balor. He's not going to win, but here you go. But with Jeff Cobb, it felt like maybe he's going to win. He didn't, but now it feels like he's just on the cusp of something. Whereas in WWE, it's, well, if they want to tell that story, it'll happen. Now with Jeff Cobb, it's Jeff Cobb is no longer the same Jeff Cobb. Jeff Cobb has grown. There's now things on his stat sheet that show that he is capable of more than he was before. And that's a really interesting thing when it comes to storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually one of the guys in that first camp. So I was a fan of Jeff Cobb when he was under a mask in another company that I'm not going to spoil for anyone. But when he came to New Japan and was doing his thing, and even kind of before that, he was working with, I think, Ring of Honor for a while. And I was never really sold on Jeff Cobb, which was interesting because at first glance, he checks all my boxes, right? He's that stocky wrestling dude who likes to throw people around and felt like he had this sort of charm to him. But no matter who he was in the ring with, I really couldn't get into his matches. And man, if this G1 did not fundamentally change my perception of Jeff Cobb, and I am fully on board the Cobb train now. And part of it is definitely because of the clear turn to heel, which we'll talk more about the heel face thing as we go on, I'm sure, but turning him into a more bad guy has definitely helped him a lot because it's allowed him to sort of lean into those parts of himself that I think he's way more comfortable with. But man, his matches weren't, it's not just that he had such a good showing as far as a win-loss record, but also those matches were just very good matches. And you see that with a lot of guys. A lot of guys are made in those tournaments, right? You've got guys like Zack Saber Jr., who one of his stats that is often talked about is that he's a tournament specialist, right? Whether it be in the World Tag League, whether it be in the G1 or anything else, or the New Japan Cup, he's always a guy who's favored to win or at least place really well because he is a tournament specialist. He was such a huge deal in the breakers for this year's event and had some insane wins over, guys like current IWGP heavyweight world heavyweight champion Shingo Takagi and more. It was really impressive, and it's cool how they can have these sort of subtle stories where, he had a year or two where he did not do very well, and it was like, well, is he off his game? Why is he off his game? Is this just the future? Has he lost it? And it's not in the same in-your-face sort of overstaged way, but even in his post-match interviews where, you'd see sometimes with an athlete who goes on a cold streak, and it's like they're concerned, and they should be. This is their livelihood, and if they're not doing well, they're not going to be here next year. And you very much could feel that in some of his frustration, down to the temper tantrums that he would throw.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see that in the sports presentation of it, where if you follow any sport, usually athletes have contracts, they sign with a team. There's typically they're with a team for a certain period of time. They might get demoted or promoted depending upon performance. But you can have somebody who signs with the team and they're signed up with certain expectations, and they greatly overperform, and then all of a sudden they're traded to another team, or they get promoted and they jump over somebody else who is blocking them to play a certain position or something like that. Or maybe they get to go sign a multi-million-dollar contract with another team the next season, or multi-year even, to make a ton of money. So that's something that these people would want to do. So if you go and have these repeated things, you build a reputation. And that's something that's important. I think more so than commentary or a graphic telling the audience, hey, this is this person's reputation. The audience gets to perceive their own reputation for the individual. And it's not, like you said before, you can't just tell if you watch a 20-minute match with one person what their reputation is. You might be able to say what their skills are, but like you can't necessarily say, well, I know what they're like. You might not be able to say what they do, and that's cool, but what are they like? And for Zack Saber Jr., that's an excellent example. But I do want to go back because as you were introducing that point, you stumbled over the title's name and rolled your eyes.
Okay, hang on. One thing I want to say before we do that, because we're going to get into that and we're going to be there for a while. I do want to jump on the concept of reputation, where another stark contrast to last week, where you could have guys as your main champion or main eventers who a decent part of your audience could be like, okay, well, they're bad, right? One of the things you said was, you holding that title, especially the main title, means you might be one of the best wrestlers in the world. And that's not always true of other companies. And I think that that's really important to talk about when you bring up reputation. You look at, the guys who have held that belt in the last few years with like Kizuchi Okada, who is, probably the best wrestler in the world right now. A guy like Kenny Omega, who is also very definitely on that list. Hiroshi Tanahashi, who was almost single-handedly responsible for saving this company at one point, because he's not just, the charismatic icon that he is, because he is, and a gorgeous man, but also just very, very, very talented in the ring. So you don't really get that same sort of, well, okay, yeah, he was the world champion, but also he's fucking trash. Why would they give him the belt most of the time? Which also ties back into where you were going next. So having said that, please continue.
Well, I'm gonna throw it back to you really quickly, because I think this also ties into reputation. And if you have the reputation, like that is the stock in the title. The title has stock in it because of its reputation. It's presented as a certain thing. And in New Japan, it's a constant. I understand titles get changed frequently, especially if you're in the United States and you watch United States wrestling. You get used to the WWE switching its titles all the time. Hell, AEW, the TNT title has what, like 3-4 different looks already? Yeah. So, and I understand that's not the main event heavyweight championship. There's a place for custom titles. I get it. That's fine. Cool. But this particular title, much as you said, Tanahashi, pulls that company through an era where it was underperforming and really needed to build some momentum. And it did. And that title became synonymous with the current crop of main event talent, the best wrestlers in the world, like Okada, like Omega, AJ Styles, you can throw in there, and Tanahashi, of course. But you look at these guys and you look at that title and you say, okay, that makes sense. That's what it is. That's this era. That's what New Japan has defined itself to be. And then they change it.
Okay. So I have a lot to say about this. And I feel like it goes back to before the title changes. So as long as it's cool with you, I'd like to do a smaller version of what we did last week with Story Time with Drake, where I promise I won't spend 40 minutes telling the story this time. But I think the prelude to talking about the title change is the story of Evil.
Oh, okay. I love this because I think there's so much that you can dissect in this story that shows how New Japan presents these characters.
Right.
I think it's an encapsulation of everything, what can go right and also kind of what can go wrong. By all means, I'm going to sit back. You take it away.
I will try not to make it as long because there is a lot more we want to cover this week. So he's busting out the timer again. Okay, so to talk about Evil and what the value of the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship is and has become, it's important to take a few steps back and talk about Los Ingobernables. Tetsuya Naito, one of the big faces of New Japan Pro Wrestling, definitely the bottom of the main event totem pole as far as it goes. He is the sort of classic underdog. Fans have always been a big fan of his faction, which we'll talk more about later, sells the most merchandise, and there's just this gaggle of misfits, right? So, like, Naito himself is very much from the school of mind games. He loves to, sit back, take it slow, find every way he can to get under your skin and piss you off and playfully make you hate him. And he's the leader of this, like, gaggle of misfits, even if arguably they have no leader. And then you've got, Sonata, who's your traditional unlimited talent, lazy guy, terrible finisher, whatever. Hiromu, who's, the little brother and a literal, like, crazy person. You've got big angry brother Shingo, who we'll talk about later as well. And then you've got Evil. And Evil has always felt a little bit out of place in this faction, if not for the fact that, the inception of it has a lot to do with Naito coming back from Mexico and getting what was considered at the time to be his best friend in Evil to join him in this venture. And so Evil takes on this persona of, like, the Lord of Darkness, right? And he's got this huge scythe, and he really leans into it, and he and Sonata tag team together a lot. And Los Ingobernables is way more of a brotherhood than just a group, which is something else we'll talk about when it comes to the factions of New Japan later on tonight. But so you have just this group of people who feel inseparable, and it's great. And then they started doing the storyline where you have Kota Ibushi, who is, determined to kill God, be the guy who rises above everyone else. He wants to be the first guy to hold the Intercontinental and the IWGP Heavyweight Championships at the same time. I would argue fundamentally that there was a flaw with this, only in that it felt like they were kind of chasing what WWE was doing at the time with, having the double champion. It felt a little bit like I could understand where they're coming from insofar as wanting Ibushi to get an accolade that no one else has had. But it also created a big problem because of how they present this as, a sport where you now have these two championships that are very prestigious and very relevant and are in their own way very valuable, to the point where the Intercontinental title has main evented Wrestle Kingdom before, like their WrestleMania, which also ties into Naito's feud with it, because it literally preempted him. But so now you've got these guys involved in the main title picture with, like, Kota Ibushi and Tetsuya Naito and whatever else. Okada, it doesn't really matter. But they have a 2-night Wrestle Kingdom. They have a whole thing set up. Ibushi is, like, primed to become the guy. But Naito is also involved in this. And for Naito, it's not really about the same things. He doesn't want to kill God. He doesn't want that. But he wants the place that he feels like he's deserved forever and has never really gotten. Like, he had a world title run. It wasn't super eventful. It feels very much like the company was not willing to invest strongly in him. And, like we talked about, New Japan is very big on character through the years of experience. So Naito has his own reasons for doing this. And he gets involved, and ultimately, to skirt over stuff because this isn't the crux of our story, he ends up winning both titles and becoming the IWGP Intercontinental Champion and the IWGP Heavyweight Champion. Fast forward a bit, after a all-right title reign with some good matches that didn't feel as strong as they should have been, partially because of COVID, unfortunately, and we get to the New Japan Cup. New Japan Cup is a big deal every year. It's a single elimination tournament, which is not something New Japan does a lot of. Most of the tournaments are like round robin, but it's a single elimination tournament where the winner gets to challenge for the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. And there are a number of people in it this year, and your champion is traditionally in it as well. And if he wins, he gets to call his shot. He can challenge whoever he wants and have the match with whomever. So, as far as the hierarchy of Los Ingobernables goes, Naito, even if he's not officially like the leader, is still the top guy. And after him, arguably, is probably Sonata. Sonata's the number 2. He's, again, the guy who has been on the precipice of breaking out, but doesn't have the motivation to do so. He doesn't care enough to. So he doesn't, but he's that guy. Meanwhile, Hiromu is in a whole different category, kind of running the junior division, arguably the best active junior at the time and today. And then you've got, Evil and Shingo who exist. Shingo is still, the newer guy in it. And I haven't even really talked about Bushi because he just has this sort of his own place in it. And he's a junior and he exists and he's there for junior tournaments and whatever. And then, like I said, there's Evil and Shingo who just sort of muddle around. They're there for tag matches. Shingo was a junior somehow for a long time. Biggest junior in the world, but that was the case. But Evil was traditionally considered like a good hand, right? They'd put him in these tournaments and he'd help guys look good, and that would be it. So that year in the New Japan Cup, 2020, we saw a very different Evil. He was aggressive, he was violent, he was there to win, and it was very clear. He didn't care about, respecting the rules, which we didn't talk about for New Japan, but we did talk about for Ring of Honor, and it's still a big deal in New Japan. Very rarely will guys who are not like clear Bullet Club guys cheat. So you've got, this whole thing where he's just sort of coming out a lot more aggressive. He's not afraid to take the opportunity to grab a chair and put it around a guy's neck and shove him into the ring post. He's not afraid to kick you in the balls while the ref isn't looking and then beat the hell out of you while you're down. He's not afraid to be that guy now and to throw his weight around really in a way we hadn't seen before. This was an Evil who was motivated. This was an Evil who so deeply and desperately, for one reason or another, was determined to win. There was no way it wasn't going to happen. He refused to let it go any other way. And so he did. Match after match after match, and it was weird. It was strange. It wasn't unwelcome, especially for me, who is a huge Los Ingobernables mark, but it was very out of left field. And on the other side of the bracket, you had Kazuchika Okada, the golden boy, the ace of the company, the guy who you think of when you think of the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, Kazuchika Okada. And he's winning his matches too. But he's also not performing the way he normally does. He's made the decision that he needs to evolve his moveset now. So he's using this thing called the money clip, which is a, what was it? It's $1 Million Dream, right? It's just a modified sleeper, and it was weird because he would go into his matches and he would give up easy wins in order to lock it in and lock it back in and lock it back in and get his wins. And there's a story to be told there too about the champion who's kind of lost himself in who he's become, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So finally, after everything has gone down and some tension between Okada and Bullet Club, which is not new, we get to Evil Okada. And Evil Okada is a hard-hitting match. These guys go at it. But again, it's the story of an Evil who is revitalized, who is focused like he's never been before, who is hungry, and an Okada who isn't interested in being here at the top level. An Okada who is more interested in getting revenge on Bullet Club for being the pains in the asses that they've been to him for the entire time since Gedo turned on him years ago, and it shows. And of course, inevitably, Bullet Club shows up. and they distract Okada, and it's a whole thing, and Evil wins. And it's crazy. It's strange. At first, it's the question of why is Bullet Club here? But okay, Bullet Club's here because Okada. They hate Okada. Fuck Okada. Ghetto revels in any opportunity to make Okada miserable. Okay. So Evil wins the New Japan Cup, and this is a huge moment for him. This is something that he's never even been close to before. This is an accolade that he's never touched on. And so, of course, the IWGP Heavyweight Champion, the IWGP Intercontinental Champion, Tetsuya Naito, comes out to congratulate his brother, the man he started this entire journey with, arguably the first guy in New Japan to look at him and go, yeah, we got this. And he throws up the fist, and Evil two-sweets him. And then he hits his finisher, and Naito's out, and he stands there over Naito as Bullet Club fills the ring, and Evil, out of completely left field, has turned on Tetsuya Naito. So, very soon after, we have the title match. And in that time, they have gone to work on finding ways to make Evil feel like something else. So Naito comes out upset, frustrated, of course, because he's been betrayed. Because he's been betrayed in the way he has been for the group he has been. And then out comes Evil. And my God, what a turnover. He comes out to this music that sounds like the apocalypse is upon us, and has completely redone his look, and even the way he walks and moves is different. He looks and feels like he's no longer the sort of campy, scythe-wielding, hooded, everything is evil priest guy, but is just the emperor of nothing, right? He's just this powerful figure that wants and deserves and demands to reign from the mountaintop. And there's more to the story, dealing with a particular commentator at ringside called Milano Collection AT, who was a huge evil mark, who had his heart just broken by this man turning on what really was his family. But Evil gets in the ring, and there is just this moment before the match starts where Naito is very clearly off his game, right? Because how could you not be? He's not here to play games. He's not here to be lazy and chill and, get you to want to come after him. He's hurt. He's broken in a deep way, and he wants to make that right. And Evil couldn't care less. Just this clear view of Evil doesn't give a fuck about any of how Naito's feeling right now or anything else, because what he sees is the opportunity to do something he's never been able to do before. Win that title. Win 2 titles that mean so much, not just to him, not just to Naito, but to the company, to the position in which he exists, to mean more than he ever has. And he's willing to do anything to get there. And it's a match, man. It's a great match. And I remember how people were really divided at first with this. A lot of people were like, really? This is what we're doing? We're going to make Evil feel like a legitimate contender? He can't win. This is not believable. What are they doing? Or, this is just a little bit too much the side of pro wrestling, sports entertainment. And I remember being like, guys, this is premium grade storytelling. There's so much here to unpack. And I wasn't sold on it at first, but when he walked out, I was sold. I was ready for whatever was coming, and boy, did it come. So Evil, with the help of Dick Togo, who is a fantastic wrestler in his own right, and, a great guy to have at ringside for you, manages to defeat Tetsuya Naito using every every bad guy method in the book, up to and including Dick Togo choking Tetsuya Naito with a garrote wire. Everything. If he can cheat to do it, he does it. Not like in Ring of Honor where they hold the rope until 5, where he'll hold the rope knowing full well that past the 5 count, the referee is not going to disqualify him. This is a title match. We need a winner. The ref's going to have to pull me off of him, and I'm going to fight to go back so Dick Togo can pull his legs out from under him. And he does it over and over and over again. And, you know, at the end of the day, he walks out with those belts. And some people are very upset because they stand by that. Why is this happening? This is completely different. This is separated from everything that this company has been for a long time now. And the idea of a guy like Evil, who, like we said, is probably best described as a good hand from bell to bell, being one of, but both of these champions is unreal. And like I said, I'm a huge New Japan mark. And I am a sucker for a good dramatic story, and I'm a huge Tetsuya Naito fan. So I loved this. The kayfabe fan in me was upset because, you know, my favorite currently active wrestler had been betrayed, but the wrestling fan, the storyteller in me was enthralled by this because it was wonderful, and it was such a great execution of that particular kind of character. Unfortunately, what followed was not. From that moment forward, everything that Evil had, everything that Evil had fought for, sort of fell away. The powerhouse that he had been portrayed as, the violent, aggressive, hungry, laser-focused monster that he was in the New Japan Cup, that he was against Tetsuya Naito, just became another generic heel who would take every route that he could to try and cheat to win. He became, for lack of a better term, the shit heel. He was the chicken shit heel. He was the guy who would pull everyone into the ring so that he could get the win. He was the guy who would grab a chair so the ref would pull it away from him so one of the 4 guys at ringside could hit, you know, his opponent in the back. And then eventually he loses the titles back to Naito after a small run. And it didn't feel like it really did anything for anyone involved. And, you know, I'll admit that I was very disappointed in it because of where it went, especially after what I felt like was a very strong start. But it was the first step in bringing us back to what we're talking about here, where they made a decision with the hopes that it would, while breaking from their tradition, allow them to create a new star in the interim while they were missing people for, you know, because of COVID and travel restrictions. And it could have worked, I feel like. It had the potential to work. But then they decided to waver from what they had done, and in doing so, they began what seemed like kind of a stumbling, staggered run forward headfirst into the wall of pro wrestling over wrestling as a sport. Because from that time until now, even though we've had some very strong championship matches, it has felt like they haven't recovered. And I don't blame Evil for that. I really don't. I blame whatever decisions they've made backstage, be it Geto or Dick Togo or whatever else, made them take the route they did. Because then they put the title back on Naito and we went back to business as usual, except for Evil.
Just as a quick thing for that, I guess, like, lambasted WWE over and over again for the non-committal half steps that they make. And New Japan doesn't seem to make those very often. So when they do, it's very apparent. And it can cause a lot of damage, the way I think it does cause damage in WWE. Just they do it so often that people are kind of used to it. And a lot of long-term fans, even if I still call myself a fan, I'm a fan of wrestling, but like somebody who watches WWE even on occasion can look and say, like, yeah, they're going to do that now because that's how they operate. Going back to the Braun Breaker, Tommaso Ciampa thing. But besides that point, when New Japan says, all right, we're going to do something, typically you look at them and say, okay, they have a plan. They're going to do something. Unless something goes very wrong that they didn't see coming, or fans react very strongly in a certain way that they did not see coming, they generally stick to the plan. And this is one of those situations where, much to what you just said, it kind of seems like a non-committal move for them, where they tried something, decided for whatever reason they didn't like it, and immediately as they do, coming off of title reigns that lasted multiple years, when you have one that lasts only a couple of months, that's very different. It's apparent. Fans can see that easily. So when you do that, fans, an exclamation point, or at the very least a question mark, appears above some people's heads and says, hey, what happened there? That's odd. I don't know about that. Why did that happen?
And it was definitely one of those moments where I think they panicked a bit. They panicked because of the really uncertain fan reaction, and they panicked because of the lack of options that they had available to them. And I think it's a good example of when a show tries something different, hears the audience reaction, and goes, well, we're so used to having everyone be like, fuck yeah, you're doing it right, that the moment people are like, they're like, okay, we can fix this, which, is one of those things we've talked about before being a concern of mine for AEW, even though it hasn't really come up. But yeah, it's a shame, because I think that there was a lot more to be done there, and what's happened with Evil since, and that whole story, is kind of the same thing we've seen out of Bullet Club for a while now, which is that stagnant, who's in charge of Bullet Club, who's really Bullet Club, and it's not really worth getting into. And I feel like it really threw away an opportunity to take a guy who was really unassuming as far as that goes, and really turn him into a force of nature. And they just sort of missed the ball on that. But the whole reason that we told this story, the story of Evil, is because, like I said, we went stumbling headfirst into a wall, where eventually there comes the question of, what are we going to do with these two titles? Are these guys going to just defend both these belts forever? Are they always going to be unified? They had a couple of matches where it was like, all right, Naito's only going to defend one or the other. They had a couple matches where it's like, all right, Naito's going to defend both in one night. But ultimately, it became a situation where it was clear that they were not interested in separating the two belts again, and the audience was not looking to watch a guy walk around with these two titles. And people were at this point losing faith in the company because of things like the Evil story and the continuation of this two belt story, and a few other things that are neither here nor there. And so they said that they were going to make an announcement regarding these titles. And the fans rejoiced, because maybe they would separate these. Maybe Naito's going to hand over one of them. Maybe we can just move on. Actually, was it Ibushi at that point who had won them? I'm trying to remember who was the champion at that time.
I believe Ibushi was the first to hold the new championship. So
right, yes.
I believe it was after Wrestle Kingdom, Ibushi announced that he was part of the announcement of, hey, here, I'm going to win both titles, and when I do, I remember. I plan on having a single title belt.
Yes, because he had the match with El Desperado. That's what it was. El Desperado, who had also sort of been having a fire year in his career and had been on a hell of a streak. So it was supposed to be someone else originally. I think it might have been supposed to be Naito, and he got hurt. But whatever the case was, it's irrelevant to what we're talking about, insofar as they made the announcement that they were going to unify these belts. And with that would come a new lineage. Although they weren't super clear on what that meant. They didn't really explain whether that meant they were going to try and combine the lineages of these two not even arguably, just flat out incredibly prestigious belts. Or if they were just going to be like, okay, Coda, whoever it's going to be who wins it, Coda, is going to be number one. And that's where we're starting from. And it was really frustrating for a lot of fans because you had, like we've discussed, the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, where if you held that belt prior to Evil winning it, there was a very legitimate conversation to be had about whether you were the best or one of the best active champions, active wrestlers in the world. And the Intercontinental title, which at one point had overshadowed that belt, had main evented Wrestle Kingdom, had Shinsuke Nakamura literally create a resurgence in Japanese wrestling based off of his run with that title. And it was a huge deal. And now we're just sort of binning them for the sake of a new belt. And it didn't help. It didn't help that the new belt looked like it belonged in an anime. It didn't. It didn't help that it looked like the Anime World Wrestling Championship belt. But again, that's neither here nor there. Because one of the... Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the look never... the look is always a piece of it, right? The Universal title gets unveiled, and it's just the WWE title. It's the same design, drenched in ketchup. So, like, when that's the case, everybody shit on that title design, not because they hated the way the WWE title looked. They were just like, this looks awful in red. Like that. That looks bad. And yeah, okay, you're announcing a new title. People want the new title. In that particular case, people wanted a new title for the fairness of the parity of those two shows.
Yeah.
Splitting Raw and SmackDown. But like the design of the title totally played a role in its acceptance. So yeah, this is one where it's like you're blowing up continuity. You're taking the lineage away. And then you're giving us a title that we don't even like the way it looks. So, ew, why are you doing this, guys? Who is making these decisions?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think is particularly difficult for New Japan, being a company that prides itself on, wrestling as a sport and having its main title feel like it is this very valuable, very prestigious thing. Whereas in WWE, it's a prop, and even if we hate it, we will accept it because the WWE universe, the kayfabe audience accepts it. And so the champion will sometimes be made by a guy who wears it or whatever. Here, you now have taken away one of the most valuable parts of your entire concept as a product in order to, I don't know, maybe try and modernize. Because it was definitely an argument a lot of people had that they had too many championships running around. But the answer was not to get rid of the ones that they did the way that they did. And in doing so, you at least created a situation where you had to come out strong. Because you had to create the concept that this title is as valuable. And you know what? They did to a point. You had Kota Ibushi, who was the guy. You had Will Osprey, who was the guy. And these were big moments. Osprey was definitely, supposed to be there. And it felt that way. And Kota already was a main event superstar, probably one of the best, definitely one of the best in the world. Sorry. And just absolutely meant to be at the top of the mountain. Is supposed to be there with guys like Okada, with guys like Tanahashi, and Osprey followed that lead.
Yeah, and also with Wrestle Kingdom going to the 2-night structure, it's given them the opportunity to do another sports-like thing, which is like the 2-night like mini tournament of 4 people generally. And it's very much like a playoffs of sorts, where in most sports you do have like a cut to a postseason. And this, it kind of felt like the cut to a postseason of here's 4 of the best guys in the world. And we're going to pair them up against each other on night 1. And then on night 2, the winners are going to face each other. And the winner of that is being crowned at the beginning of the year the best wrestler that we have. There you go. That's your champion. Bet. Go for it. And that's one of the strongest moves you can make in terms of doing something like this, especially with the sports like feel.
Right. And then unfortunately you have the situation where, Kota gets hurt and then Osprey gets hurt. And so you're left with having to find another champion. Like we already discussed, it's kind of a hard sell for them because the pandemic hits them harder than, other companies. And The change in title hits them harder than other companies, and the lack of having access to certain talent hits them harder than other companies. So they set up a situation which is kind of the best that it can be, which results in having Kizuchi Okada versus Shingo Takagi. And when I say to you that Kizuchi Okada and Shingo Takagi are going to have a match for the IWGP Anything Heavyweight Championship, who wins?
Well, I mean, I've said to you jokingly at the time, LOL, Shingo wins, because obviously you take the safe bet and go with Okada. He is the proven champion, and let's flash back a year where they look at Lij and they pluck a guy who has not been in this position before, and it doesn't go well, so they backtrack next to immediately. And so, of course, they wouldn't do that again.
And not to underplay Shingo Takagi or his incredible talent. He's a phenomenal talent. He is, in my opinion, ready to be a main eventer, but at no point was he presented as building his way up to that point. He didn't feel like he was trying to break through any glass ceiling. He didn't feel like he was on the cusp. And I remember watching that match live, and I turned to my partner to say something like right after Shingo hits like a Made in Japan or the Last Dragon. I forget which one. And I'm like, this is a safe moment for me to do this. And I look over at her and I go to say something, and then I hear the bell. And I hear Shingo's music, and I hear Kevin Kelly saying that Shingo Takagi is the new IWGP World Heavyweight Champion. And I remember just looking at her and being so absolutely stunned. And we just shared this moment of sheer bewilderment, not because, it's Shingo and we didn't want Shingo to win. I love Shingo. I was rooting for Shingo the whole match. But because there was no way he was going to. And it's just a weird decision to make after having made a weird decision the year earlier, like you said, after having had the fan backlash that they had from making the changes they did, after having had the fan backlash from the title looking the way it did and everything else, to kind of skirt the guy who felt like the safest way to restabilize in favor of, trying something new again and trying to make a new main guy kind of out of left field, which, brings us back to the conversation about the cons of wrestling as a sport. These risks that you take can be so much more damaging to you as a company than were you a drama where you can kind of just hand wave it away in a week or two with damn near anything.
Yeah, and for people who follow sports, you've seen this through 2020, even into 2021 throughout the pandemic, where teams played in front of no fans and they played abridged versions of their seasons. I'm a baseball fan. I've seen the MLB play a 60 game season as opposed to the regular 162 game season with a very different playoff format, to the point where the Dodgers win the World Series and you have everyone who's not a Dodgers fan saying, yeah, but they didn't win it in a real season. Like, that wasn't a real World Series win.
Agreed.
Okay, well, see, you have it right there. You have fans who are going to look at that for the rest of time and put in a little asterisk next to that win and say it didn't count. Whereas they won, that you can't take the win away from them. You can look at like how they won, and I'm not saying they cheated or anything, but they won what was available for them to win in the only way they could. Any other team, it would have happened the exact same way. Whereas the other 29 fan bases out there would have looked and said, doesn't count. It's not the same. It's not a real one. It's the abridged one. So for New Japan, similarly, this is one of those where you look at stuff and say, well, they made choices because of COVID in a weird way that devalues the title a bit. It kind of, because it devalues the company as a whole, where you see through the veil in a way that you haven't previously, of they're making choices because they have to, not because they want to. And unfortunately, that impacts this title, which now is not even the same title anymore, but it has some carryover, as you've explained, from the previous title of they're making some of these decisions in awkward ways. And now you have Shingo, who, all credits to Shingo, has done a good job. I'm not going to say great job, but good job doing what he can do to be the champion that he can be. Because now you have a championship that needs to be elevated.
And while it's not the focus of tonight's episode, and so we won't super get into it, I would argue that there's still more self-sabotage going on because we've got, two guys going around calling themselves the world heavyweight champion and one guy going around saying he's the heavyweight champion, which is also, kind of a mess.
That's fair. I will give them enough credit that they've earned for the last decade to say, I hope there's a plan here that Wrestle Kingdom, which is coming very soon, will be a big payoff to some of this, if not all of it. And hopefully will establish something, a new normal going forward for New Japan where it all makes sense and everybody's happy. I don't think that will be the case necessarily where everybody's happy, but enough people will be happy.
Yeah, I agree. I hope very much that we see a return to, if not the status quo, some kind of normalcy for this company that has put on a great product for a very long time.
Totally agree completely. Not to fantasy book too much, but ideally make Shingo, make him the man, have him win 2 nights in a row, beat Osprey, beat Okada. There you go. Can't be better than that. So if you make Shingo, if Shingo's the guy now, right? If you have him beat Okada, if you have him beat Osprey, if he is your new champion, he's the top guy. You have another guy that you've successfully made out of LIJ, which takes you back to this group of LIJ where you've successfully, it took a while, but Naito got there. Now Shingo's there. Well, at least I hope. This is a little presumptuous, but let's say Shingo's there. You've already gone through that they've got the juniors on lock right now. But sticking to the heavyweight division, Sonata feels like he's a guy who can make it there. He's got the tools to make it there, and he's had title matches before. Maybe not like immediately, but he's had those short runs before. And that brings us to how New Japan is set up, where these factions, these groups, they really matter. They're big, significant pieces that are focal points to their storytelling without necessarily being all about backstage promos where the groups are talking to each other all the time. It goes back to the idea of sports, and there's teams in sports more often than not. And these guys are teams. And for wrestling, all the teams aren't the same size and they're not all equal. But occasionally you get ones now like LIJ where you have some star players on a team. And hopefully Shingo gets his coming out party really, really soon. The big one to be maybe the top guy for LIJ.
Right. And in the way that you have kind of brought this up, and it's a good point, the teams in New Japan specifically feel very much, with a few exceptions, like I would say maybe Los Ingobernables feels the least like that. But most of these groups, these teams, these factions feel like fight camps, right? It's very much in the idea of the UFC or boxing where you see this sort of camaraderie in a shared belief of the sport or shared belief of how that sport should be prepared for or presented. And it's through that you see these people as a group, right? Very rarely, if ever, will you see certain members of different factions working together outside of like, here's a 12-person tag team match, so we're going to have 6 guys from Chaos together, and you'll get Yoshihashi and Kizuchi Okada and Toru Yano on the same team. But beyond that, you'll probably never see that. And there will be plenty of times where you do see, Hiroki Goto take on Tomohiro Ishii, despite the fact that they're both from Chaos, because, at the end of the day, what unites them is that drive, right? That desire.
Yeah, because the end goal is still the same of there can only be one heavyweight champion of the world. And ideally it's in your faction. You'd love it if your teammate is the guy who's main eventing. but you'd also love it if you were the guy main eventing. And so there's nothing wrong with chaos versus chaos if they're both in the main event, or even if the winner of that match is in the main event. Competition, the what is it, the rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Yeah.
So the competition, the inner group competition, it's not conflict necessarily. It's not bad conflict. It's, hey, okay, look, we're both good. Let's prove who's better. Going back to the Ring of Honor thing. We go in the ring, we can look across the ring from the other person, show respect, beat the hell out of each other. May the best man win. We go back to the locker room. Cool, you got it. Blow off steam, whatever needs to be done. Go get them. They're not from our group. Go beat them. Chaos roots for chaos. And that's something that New Japan does really well. So and also much to what you described before with evil turning on Lij on Naito, having that happen in the way that it's set up with these factions, that is such a thing where you can look and not see that coming because it doesn't make sense. You could have had evil versus Naito for the title, and it wasn't a thing where Lij splits up and everybody goes their separate ways. Or it's a giant heel turn where, oh, you can't trust this guy anymore, and he joins Bullet Club. Because it makes sense. That would be a legitimate thing of, hey, look, we can have a competitive thing as brothers, as friends, as allies, where the championship is on the line.
And you have a lot of opportunity for storytelling from a bunch of different angles because of that. You also saw it with the whole thing where Geto, who was Okada's manager for a long time, and we talked a little bit about this too, betrayed Okada, joined Jay White, and when he left for Bullet Club, and even with a faction like Bullet Club, where they're the guys who purposefully are underhanded and are willing to cheat and don't abide by these unwritten rules of honor in this case, where even between themselves they will cheat and they'll try and screw each other over, but at the end of the day everyone gets a too sweet, everyone gets a hug, and everything is hunky-dory 85% of the time.
Yeah, and then to counterpoint just very quickly for WWE, you generally don't see the larger factions, and when you do, they don't last for a very long time. Why? Because anytime there is that intergroup conflict, that is part of a storyline. It's deliberately there. It's designed to say, hey, this is a problem and it needs to be addressed because we're telling stories here. So why would there be conflict if there's not going to be further drama from that conflict? So inherently, if there's a problem in the group, the problem doesn't just go away because the more compelling story is something has to happen. Whereas in New Japan, no, normal conflict in life, like you can fight with a friend and then make up afterward. You can have a friendly rivalry. Like that's an actual saying. It's a phrase. It's a thing. So you can do that. Sports teams go out and have rivalries all the time, but they don't get into fights all the time. Sometimes they do, and then they get suspended. But other times they can just look and say, all right, look, the better team won. We don't like it. We're going to go beat them next time. It happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And New Japan has always, well, for a long time, has handled this entire concept of factions very well. From, interfaction warfare to just the natural feel of these as, sports camps. You have the guys who are kind of the, like, mouthpieces, whether it's Geto for Bullet Club or if it's like Yano with Chaos. It very much feels like you've got your hype men, you've got your top tier talent, you've got your secondary talent. It's like it's very much like MMA. It's very much in the same sort of feel of that, which makes sense if you look at the history of New Japan, where they have a lot of ties to at the MMA community. You've got a lot of talent who have backgrounds training in different mixed martial arts or even more specific martial arts. You've got guys like Suzuki who are like legit killers, for lack of a better term. And as a company, they've just had this really long ongoing relationship with, mixed martial arts as a whole.
Yeah, and they flow between sports and professions more freely than happens in the United States with WWE. where you can look and say a guy like Brock Lesnar almost as the exception to the rule, where he is someone who is amateurly trained, he's successful at that level, then he becomes a pro wrestler in WWE, then he leaves, hops over and does MMA, is successful, comes back, does both for a period of time, and is still going in pro wrestling. Brock Lesnar is very unique in that way, whereas most other people who have any crossover whatsoever, it's you do one, then you kind of retire from that, then you do the other. Usually some type of MMA, then pro wrestling. A couple of people have done it the other way around. They're very exceptional people, whereas in Japan, specifically with New Japan, it seems to be, look through history at their roster. You can see plenty of guys who have either the training, the discipline, whatever it takes to do both, sometimes to do both simultaneously. And both companies are okay with that because it's a lot more accepted there in a certain way. And the history of New Japan shows that this very much comes into how these guys portray themselves in the ring. The birth of strong style and all of that is very much a thing there because of this type of these disciplines, this background, the MMA style of the hard hitting tough guy.
And I think that's actually a really good opportunity for us to, while still talking about New Japan, transition a little bit more away from the strict concept of New Japan as a company back into the idea of wrestling as a sport, as a presentation, where we look at how it got here, right? Because even at its height in the America, in the US, you look at wrestling and it was never really that. It was, even when it was kayfabe to be so, right? But you look at Japan, and specifically New Japan, and you look at Inokiism as sort of the birth for what became the modern take on pro wrestling as a sport. And for all its downsides, because Inokiism was hands down just an absolutely terrible idea that did have a lot of downsides and cause a lot of problems for a lot of people in the business, physically, mentally, etc. It did allow for the concept to break through and for them to go, okay, well, there's a thought here that works really well. We just have to figure out where that balance is between having these guys who are going out there and have to have that like fighting spirit, that like heated blood contest sport, and not actually having them go out there and have an MMA fight.
Yeah, you can have that again, that strong styles type thing, the types of matches where, in the United States, you would see stuff more like eh, tied to the Greco-Roman or like catch as catch can styles. Whereas in Japan, it is a bit more hard hitting. You're not hurting the other person severely to cause permanent damage, but you are landing blows that are leaving noticeable marks in ways that you don't necessarily see in the United States so much.
Yeah.
It is a drastically different style in that regard, even if some of the moves are very similar.
And what it does is it presents this opportunity. So, wrestling is a sport, using all of these things that we've discussed. It presents this really cool opportunity for this unique version of storytelling where you could arguably sit down and watch one episode of New Japan, and whatever it is, a pay-per-view, a touring episode, whatever, and you could get an understanding for the types of styles that these people, these athletes, use in order to try and get themselves the victories that they're trying to get. And in some cases, you could even see a bit of character work insofar as how they interact with each other. But like you kind of joked about last time, unless you're going to sit down and do a Google search and go through all of their history, there's a lot of things you don't really get into right away. So it does have a bit higher of a cap. But what's really rewarding about it is that as you watch more of it and as you invest in these athletes and the personas behind the athletes, you do find yourself emotionally tied to these guys. When you're in, minute like 37 of a 60-minute IWGP Heavyweight Championship match, and you know that one of these guys has been fighting his way up the ladder for the last 3 years to get this opportunity, and now has to face a guy who is essentially an end boss in pro wrestling, and it means something. You watch a guy like Kota Ibushi have a match against Hiroshi Tanahashi, and it's like, okay, well, there was a point where if you're just sitting down and watching this, you're going to see a great match. It's going to be phenomenal, and you're going to get sucked in because, they have their ways of really adding the passion of their personas to their matches. But if you've been watching for a year or 2 years or 3 years, you understand that Kota Ibushi, this is everything. This is that moment that he has the opportunity to prove, not to anyone else, but just to himself, that he could really be the top guy. Because sure, he can beat Okada, and Okada's like number one right now. But to him, the once in a century talent signifies so much more. He did so much more for the company, for the industry, for the business, and continues to be such a big force now, even if he's, slowed down just a bit. It means so much more to him because of that. And you get that from, the interviews, and you get that from watching these 8-man tag matches, or even just watching the last time that they had a match. And it's so interesting to see, instead of this drama being played out before your eyes, the TV show, the staged show, to see these athletes who, I'm not a huge basketball guy, but I'm gonna try and make this comparison work. See, like, LeBron and Michael Jordan have these like moments where it's like, well, here we are sharing a field, right? We're sharing a court. I'm not so bad at basketball, I don't know that term. Sharing a court, and that means something, right? And you don't have to know everything to be able to see or understand that recognition, which I think is a really cool, unique aspect of, professional wrestling as a shoot sport, as a legitimate sport, as opposed to anything else, is in how it allows you to have completely human beings, even if Kota Ibushi's whole character is that he is quite literally a shonen protagonist. But you can have these guys who are people who, by contrast of what we talked about with wrestling as a stage show, where when it's time for character shifts, we can forget about everything that happened beforehand. Here, their characters are the total summation of their careers from start to finish, and everything is relevant all the time. You don't get repackaged, you don't get rebranded, you just evolve, whether it's in a good way or a bad way. You just continue to be the person you were yesterday, with new information, with new knowledge, with new skill, with new ability and new intent. And I think that that's something that's so unique to them. And I think that that's something that's so unique to the concept of, wrestling as a sport.
You explained to me last week the difference between wrestling as a stage show versus wrestling as a crowd show. And this is the latter, right? This is wrestling as a crowd show. And one of the pieces of that, based on what you just said, was you are conditioning your audience to make educated assumptions about these people and what they're doing, because you watch them, and you watch them repeatedly to say, oh, okay, last time they did this time they did this again. That's how they win. So when they do this, I expect them to win. Then sometimes they lose. Well, why did they lose? And instead of commentary just telling you, you get to piece those things together yourself. And if you stay with it long enough, you get more and more of a story. Same way you would following an athlete through their career. Like the basketball reference of, if you see two star players on the court opposing each other, or even on the same team, it means something to you. Why? Because if you followed their careers, you know why they're star players. You know why Kenny Omega versus Kazuchika Okada is so important. Because if you followed Kenny Omega and Kazuchika Okada, you know who they are, you know what they do, you know why they do these things, you know their motivation besides just the title, which is kind of the be all end all motivator. But for Kenny Omega, it is about proving something. For Kazuchika Okada, it is about retaining something.
So, just real quick, I'm not going to talk for another 10 minutes, but to piggyback off that, one of my favorite Kenny Omega moments isn't him and Okada, because there was the I think it was his last Wrestle Kingdom, where it was him and Tanahashi, and they had
Oh god,
Kenny's Quest.
I love that match. I love that match so much. Everything about it. Just go, please.
Well, no, I definitely want to hear what you have to say. All I was going to say about it is that it's the perfect example of what we're talking about here, and the summation of a career where even though he and Tanahashi are not rivals, they didn't have that same kind of back and forth that he had with Okada. It's what it means because of their careers, because of who they are and what they mean in their own context, not just with each other.
Oh, exactly. And the fact that they did it not only through promos, because they had the promos going into Wrestle Kingdom, because it is the be all end all event for them, but in the match itself, they told that story of Omega being the guy who is not always true to himself, and he doesn't represent all of the values that that title represents. The way Tanahashi is that guy. He literally, his attire is based, it is completed by the title. He is the person who holds it near and dear, and everything that he looks at, he cherishes. So he could turn, he could see Okada wearing it and representing New Japan well, and he can sleep well at night even if he doesn't hold it himself. Whereas when he sees Omega, he's like, no, it's not you, you're not that guy, and I can prove it to you. If fine, you beat Okada, cool, but you didn't beat me, and I will beat you. And he pulls moves out of Kenny's past to beat him with the Styles Clash and everything, just being like, look, man, you've betrayed other people, and I will show you that that is not the way.
Yeah.
And putting it all together and winning the title like that, I love that match. I adore that match for those reasons, because it puts all those pieces together. And I'm not somebody who followed New Japan for 10 years leading into this. I got that quickly because they told that story well, and they told it in the ring bell to bell well, which is something they try to do all the time. You know, conditioning their audience to say, hey, if you learn to pay attention to the details that matter, we will show you all the details that matter. Trust us, believe in us, watch, pay attention, keep your attention the whole way through, and you will notice these things. And come back and watch again. You'll notice again. You'll get the whole story.
And that is just perfectly said. That's exactly why New Japan is always going to be, as far as I'm concerned, my home company. It's always going to be my favorite company. It's always going to be my favorite style of wrestling presentation, because having the ability to, over such a long period of time, or such a short period of time if need be, offer so much meaning and passion and heart is, for me, so much more valuable than anything else that pro wrestling offers. I am just so deeply in love always with that above everything else. Character work is great on the microphone, but give it to me in the ring. Show me two guys who are willing to die going to 60 minutes. Show me two guys who are willing to look at each other and go, the reasons that I refuse to acknowledge you are so much more than because you called me a poopy butt head on the microphone last week. And those storylines, no matter where they come from, because they happen in a lot of companies, but New Japan consistently does that, where it's just when they go into a big match with big match people, there is so much behind it that you feel long before the bell rings. So here's a question, since we're talking about this. What do you believe is the biggest boon? Because we've talked about a number of them tonight. What do you believe is the biggest boon of wrestling presented as a sport?
Wow, that is a tricky, heavy, complicated question.
Well, I got to keep us at 2 hours somehow.
Thanks. I'm still aiming for that hour 45 mark. But it's tricky, right? It's very tricky because I think it all comes back to what, as a member of the viewing audience, do you watch pro wrestling for? What do you want out of this? Are you in it for the moments? Are you in it for the matches? Are you in it for the stories? Personally, I'm in it for the stories. And I said last week, I typically side for the storytelling, maybe outside the ring versus bell to bell. However, what I do think the strength of it is the bell to bell. And the bell to bell storytelling is what I think you get out of it, because you're not trying to always have your guys on microphones. You're not always trying to put cameras behind the scenes and tell these really complicated things. Sometimes the simplest stories are the best ones. And sometimes that's as simple as, I want to be the best. And let me show you that I can be. And that's a very simple story, and it can be told with almost anyone over almost any period of time. Sometimes that takes an entire career. Sometimes somebody gets hot shotted and they're there in seconds. But those are all different stories. And all those stories can be told really well, uniquely, interestingly, with dynamic character growth and development. And I think going back to another thing from last week of slotting that action figure into the piece of the story, this allows for people to grow and change. This allows for people to appear in a different light, to learn, to adapt, and to connect with an audience and their peers in different ways over a period of time, in a way that you can't just do when somebody's playing a role, because then you need to change the role, not the person. This is the person themselves can provide you unique skills and abilities to change their own role over time. And that's something that I think is the real strength behind this. That's something that I think attracts me to it, where the series of matches between Okada and Omega, I understand I'm not alone in looking at that as some of the greatest matches of all time. But what draws me to them is not necessarily the fact that they were all long and quality matches, but what is the story of those matches together, individually and together? What was told there? And I think that story is what really holds up, not just the bell to bell action. That's what it is for me. That storytelling, that unique perspective of storytelling with dynamic characters.
Yeah, absolutely. You took the words right out of my mouth. For the sake of not just sitting here and going, yes, I agree, the end, I will provide another look into something else. What I value a lot out of the presentation of the product is the ability to create stars without them having to be your world champions. There are a lot of guys in New Japan who have never and will never be the IWGP champion, whether it be world heavyweight or anti-super galactic anime, whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever the case may be, there are guys there who are top tier talent who, without question, are on that list of, like, let's say top 10 best wrestlers in the world, who will never be world champion. And it doesn't take anything away from them. You look at a guy like Tomohiro Ishii, again, whose name has come up a number of times tonight, and he is phenomenal. He is a great athlete. He's a great wrestler. He's a very good salesman. He's very good at putting over himself and whoever he's in the ring with and consistently putting on fantastic matches. He probably will never be world champion. But that doesn't take away his stock. It doesn't change his value, as opposed to, like we talked about before, last week, and like we've been making comparisons tonight, where you look at the alternative product, when you look at, wrestling as a drama, as a stage show, you see the titles are very, very heavily sold when they need to be sold, right? And there are a lot of guys who are top guys who never hold any of those titles. And as a fan, sometimes you come out feeling kind of cheated because they're not as selective with who holds that prop. They're not as selective with who gets to reign with it. They're not as selective about the guys that they entrust with that momentum, because at the end of the day, it's about the story being told more than it is about the level of talent or the quality of match. And here you have almost, I don't want to say just the opposite. Here you have, with very few exceptions, you have to be special to hold that title. It's not about being the best in the world. It's more than that. And like, we've used that term a lot tonight, but it's more than that, really. It's not that Okada happens to be one of the best wrestlers in the world. It's that he has that it factor. It's not that Omega just happens to be one of the best in the world. It's that he's one of the best in the world and also feels like he's a huge, bigger than life talent. Tanahashi, Kota Ibushi, Will Osprey, the list goes on. Shinsuke Nakamura, all of these guys who have held that title have felt like guys who are above and beyond. Even like, some people will put a guy like Jay White at the bottom of that list and be like, maybe he's the exception. And I wholly disagree with that. Jay White is a guy who I feel like maybe doesn't come off the same way, but the way that he carries himself and the way that he presents himself and the way that he wins his matches is still this very legitimate, very deliberate, very specific thing, right? You look at the like TTO, the Tanahashi tap out, which is such a great example of this thing where it's like, okay, so maybe he's not as good as Okada. Maybe he's not as good as Kenny Omega. Maybe he's not as good as Kota Ibushi. But he beat Tanahashi. He beat the guy Kenny couldn't get over when it mattered most. And he did it by making him submit, which is a big deal. He can still find these ways where his matches feel good, because even when he cheats, even when he does break the rules just flat out, which he doesn't do as much as he used to or didn't leading up to now. You know, now he's doing stuff at Impact and it's a whole different thing, but it feels different. His matches don't feel like just anyone else in New Japan's, and I'll defend that to the death because he really is a very, very powerful talent, and maybe he got that position because they needed a new gaijin with Kenny leaving, but they gave it to him because they trusted him, and he absolutely ran with it. So you look at Will Osprey as another great example where, you know, regardless of the title design and the problems we've discussed, Will Osprey has that it factor. Will Osprey is absolutely a generational talent. You look at Shingo, and even though he hasn't been positioned that way yet, I hope that we can both agree Shingo is, if not now, one day will be, without a doubt, considered one of the elite talent in that company. And I think that that's really what sets this sort of product apart. You don't have to be special, I say that with quotations, in order to be at the top of the mountain, right? You can never hold that title and still mean so much. And that's one of the things I really love about this product, is that you can have those guys who will never be the main event world champion and still feel like they have had a full, validated, real career.
That's awesome. Well said. I agree completely. And I'll also just quickly throw out, investment in factions and teams is there in a way that I appreciate it. That is something you don't always get. And it's just a cool thing to see. I'm not going to go into like too much detail about that. That's just a very surface level thing that I enjoy.
Yeah, it's a great feature of the product as it's presented. Which brings me to the next part of this wonderful program that we've been doing over the last 2 weeks, and we'll be continuing in part 3 next week, which is AEW, and to a lesser extent, companies like Impact, which are sort of the middle ground between pro wrestling as a sport and pro wrestling as a television drama or a staged show and a crowd show, where they sort of are a show that exists in the wink wink nudge nudge land of being New Japan, but are a show about that company instead of just being that company. They are one less step removed than WWE and one more step removed than New Japan. But that's part 3 for next week, so stay tuned for that.
Otherwise known as part 3, the curious case of Cody Rhodes. Hashtag Cody did nothing wrong. Hashtag Cody solved racism.
Oh my goodness. Ooh. I know you've been chomping at the bit for that one. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. Because you're right, there's a lot of Cody that does have to be discussed there from a lot of different angles. And not just like, haha, Cody's weird.
No, I mean that seriously. Like, it is actually a very curious case that you can dissect, and I find it fascinating.
Yeah, as do I. And I'm really looking forward to it. And I feel like it's probably going to be one of the places where you and I may not always see eye to eye, which I think should be a really cool opportunity too.
It's bound to happen eventually. But before we go, and I'm hoping more people join us next time as we continue to go down this road, but we do have to just stop for a minute and get pretty serious and say we hope Jeff Hardy is okay. We hope that whatever is going on with him, I'm speaking for both of us here, but correct me if I'm wrong, he's been released from WWE because supposedly he has partaken in substances that he is not willing to go to rehab to address on WWE's dime. So they had to cut ties, which can't blame them. It's only so much they can do in such a circumstance. Their hands are pretty much tied. You can't keep sending them out to the ring. We've seen before, unfortunately, what that looks like, and it's not pretty. We are coming off a situation where Jon Moxley has taken the steps necessary to get the help that he needs, and the wrestling world has come together to applaud him for it and say, we'll be here when you get back. Unfortunately, Jeff Hardy so many times in his career has faced the same situation, and he is now without a job for it. I personally hope that he does get the help that he needs wherever that may be, and that he is able to live the healthiest life he can.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation a lot of the time, and we can't possibly know all of the factors, and that's okay. But everyone stumbles sometimes. As and I've mentioned this before in the past. I don't shy away from this really as someone who's had substance abuse problems in my history. It can be tough, and it's important to just remember that everyone makes mistakes, and it doesn't have to be the one that opens up the door, right? There's always help out there. There's always places you can turn. There's always going to be opportunities to get better. We don't know what it is. We don't know how bad it is. We don't know what's what. But here's all hoping that everything goes well, that he gets the help and support and love that he needs. And yeah, just positive vibes overall going out to him. So I guess that's going to do it for tonight's episode. Stay tuned for part 3 coming next week, where we're going to discuss AEW and everything else that goes around the idea of merging these two separate concepts of presentation for the world of pro wrestling. So for myself and Joe, thanks for listening. Don't forget to give us a like, share, comment, subscribe, wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts, whether it be, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, or over on YouTube. You can also always reach out to us at Squared Circle SD on Twitter. We love feedback. Give us feedback. We want it so bad. Thanks for listening.